The morning mist clung to Pearl Harbor like a shroud, concealing the fate that would soon befall the Pacific Fleet. At 0600 hours on December 7, 1941, the Hawaiian sun had barely begun to pierce the tropical darkness when the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared toward their unsuspecting target. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, leading the aerial armada from his Nakajima B-5N Cape bomber, peered through the cockpit glass at the serene waters below, knowing that within minutes, the world would change forever. The attack had been months in the making. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of Japan's naval strategy, had conceived this audacious strike as the opening gambit in what he hoped would be a swift Pacific War. Yamamoto understood America's industrial might better than most of his contemporaries, having studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he would later reflect, though whether he spoke these exact words remains debated by historians. The Japanese task force, designated Kido Butai, had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the remote Kuril Islands on November 26th. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the strike force of 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These floating fortresses carried over 400 aircraft, their decks packed with dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, all meticulously prepared for this moment of infamy. As reported in contemporary naval intelligence bulletins, the Japanese had maintained strict radio silence during their northern Pacific approach, avoiding heavily traveled shipping lanes and maintaining perfect operational security. The fleet had refueled from tankers at sea, a complex operation that demonstrated the sophistication of Japanese naval logistics. Weather conditions favored the attackers, with heavy cloud cover concealing their approach until the final hours. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, the American Pacific Fleet lay at anchor in what its commanders believed was impregnable security. Battleship Row presented a magnificent sight in the early morning light. USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Maryland, USS Tennessee, USS Nevada, and USS Pennsylvania. These steel titans, representing decades of American naval engineering and millions of taxpayer dollars, bobbed gently at their moorings, their crews beginning the lazy routine of a peaceful Sunday morning. Rear Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had received various intelligence warnings in recent weeks, but nothing that specifically indicated an imminent attack on Pearl Harbor. The prevailing military wisdom suggested that any Japanese strike would target the Philippines, Singapore, or the Dutch East Indies. Pearl Harbor, over 2,000 miles from the nearest Japanese base, seemed beyond the range of effective assault. The USS Arizona's crew was preparing for morning colors when lookouts reported aircraft approaching from the north. Initially dismissed as a training flight from the nearby Army airfields, these distant specks would soon reveal their true nature. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg stood on the bridge, reviewing the day's schedule, unaware that he had less than 2 hours to live. At Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, American aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip, arranged for easy maintenance rather than rapid deployment. The Army Air Corps had been more concerned with sabotage than aerial attack, a tragic miscalculation that would cost dearly. Colonel William Farthing, commanding officer at Hickam Field, was enjoying his morning coffee when the first bombs began to fall. The stage was set for one of history's most devastating surprise attacks, an assault that would transform America from a reluctant observer to an active participant in the world's greatest conflict. At 07:55 hours, Commander Fukuda's voice crackled across the radio waves with the coded message that would echo through history: Tora, Tora, Tora. The transmission, meaning Tiger, 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 informed the Japanese fleet that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Below him, Pearl Harbor lay spread out like a detailed military map, its defenses utterly unprepared for the storm about to break upon them. The first wave consisted of 183 aircraft, 43 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, 49 Nakajima B-5N Cape high-level bombers, 51 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, and 40 Cape torpedo bombers, specially modified for shallow water attacks. These torpedo planes, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, would prove devastatingly effective against the moored battleships. Seaman First Class James Ward aboard the USS Oklahoma was among the first to spot the incoming aircraft, initially mistaking them for American planes conducting an unscheduled exercise. Ward's confusion turned to horror as he observed the distinctive red circles painted on the aircraft wings. "Those are Japanese planes," he shouted to his shipmates, his voice barely audible above the growing roar of engines. The first bomb struck Fort Island at 07:55, sending geysers of earth and concrete skyward. Simultaneously, torpedo bombers began their low-level runs against Battleship Row, their pilots displaying remarkable skill and courage as they navigated through increasingly intense anti-aircraft fire. The USS Oklahoma took the first torpedo hit at 07:56, followed quickly by 3 more strikes that began the battleship's death roll. According to declassified Navy Department records from 1942, the coordination between different elements of the Japanese attack demonstrated exceptional planning and execution. While torpedo planes focused on the battleships, dive bombers targeted the airfields. As fighters strafed any target of opportunity, the multi-pronged assault overwhelmed American defenses that had been designed to repel a more conventional attack. Captain Mervyn Benyon of the USS West Virginia was mortally wounded by bomb fragments early in the attack, but remained at his post, directing damage control efforts until his death. His executive officer, Commander Roscoe Hillenkoetter, later described Benyon's final moments with profound respect. "The captain stayed on the bridge, giving orders to save the ship and her crew, even as his life ebbed away." The USS Arizona suffered the most catastrophic loss when a modified 16-inch artillery shell, dropped from high altitude, penetrated her forward magazine at 0806. The explosion lifted the 32,000-ton battleship partially out of the water before she settled back, broken and burning. Over 1,000 sailors and Marines perished in that single, terrible moment. Seaman First Class Russell Lott, one of the few Arizona survivors, later recalled the explosion as like the end of the world. At Hickam Field, Second Lieutenant Robert Rasmussen was preparing for a routine training flight when Japanese dive bombers began their attack on the closely parked aircraft. They came in low and fast. Rasmussen remembered years later, "Our planes were sitting ducks, lined up perfectly for destruction." Within minutes, most of the Army Air Corps' aircraft at both Hickam and Wheeler fields were burning wrecks. The few American pilots who managed to get airborne faced overwhelming odds. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, flying P-40 Warhawks from Haliwa Field, engaged the Japanese aircraft with desperate courage. Welch shot down for enemy planes during the attack, while Taylor claimed victories despite being wounded. Their heroic efforts provided small but significant bright spots in an otherwise catastrophic morning. Admiral Kimmel, watching the destruction from his headquarters, reportedly stood transfixed as his fleet died before his eyes. A spent bullet crashed through his office window, striking him in the chest but failing to penetrate his uniform. "It would have been merciful had it killed me," he later told subordinates, understanding that his career and reputation were as doomed as his ship's. The first wave of the attack lasted approximately 30 minutes, but the destruction was already immense. As the Japanese aircraft circled for their return to the carriers, black smoke rose from a dozen major fires, and the harbor waters were slick with fuel oil and debris. At 0840 hours, as the first wave of Japanese aircraft disappeared toward the horizon, a brief lull settled over Pearl Harbor. American sailors and Marines, their initial shock giving way to grim determination, worked frantically to organize defenses and rescue survivors from the water. Many believed the worst was over. They were tragically mistaken. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led the second wave of 171 aircraft toward the still-burning naval base. This formation consisted of 54 Nakajima B-5NK high-level bombers, 78 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, and 39 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Their primary targets were the oil storage facilities, the naval yard installations, and any ships that had survived the first assault. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a prime target for the second wave. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, the ship's navigator, had managed to slip her moorings and was attempting to reach the harbor entrance when Shimazaki's dive bombers spotted the moving vessel. Recognizing that a sinking ship in the narrow channel would block the harbor for months, the Japanese pilots concentrated their attacks on Nevada with devastating intensity. Chief Boatswain Edwin Hill had volunteered to cast off Nevada's lines during the first attack, swimming through burning oil to reach the mooring quays. His heroic actions enabled the battleship's escape attempt, but Hill paid the ultimate price, succumbing to severe burns shortly after completing his mission. For his extraordinary courage, Hill would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor as dive bombers screamed down at the Nevada. Ensign Joseph Taussig, despite severe wounds to both legs, remained at his anti-aircraft gun directing fire at the attackers. "I could see the pilot's face as he dove toward us," Taussig later recounted. "He was young, probably no older than myself, but in that moment he represented everything we were fighting against." Contemporary military analyses, as documented in War Department files from 1942, noted that American anti-aircraft fire was significantly more effective during the second wave. Gun crews who had survived the initial attack were now alert and angry. Their marksmanship improved by desperate necessity. Several Japanese aircraft were shot down, including dive bombers attacking the Navy Yard and Hickam Field. The USS Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, sat in Dry Dock No. 1 alongside the destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs. Japanese dive bombers targeted this concentration of vessels with methodical precision. A bomb struck between the two destroyers, igniting their fuel and ammunition. The resulting explosion and fires destroyed both vessels and severely damaged Pennsylvania, though the battleship's heavy armor prevented catastrophic loss of life. At the submarine base, the USS Curtis, a seaplane tender, fought a running battle with Japanese dive bombers. Her crew's accurate gunfire damaged several attackers, but the ship took multiple bomb hits. Chief Machinist Peter Tomic remained below decks, ensuring that boilers maintained steam pressure, enabling the ship's guns to continue firing. Tomic died at his post when the final bomb struck, but his sacrifice saved countless shipmates. The attack on the oil storage tanks, critical to Pacific Fleet operations, proved less successful than Japanese planners had hoped. American anti-aircraft fire was particularly intense around these facilities, and several bombers were shot down before reaching their targets. The massive fuel reserves, which would have taken months to replace, survived largely intact. Captain Logan Ramsey, operations officer at Patrol Wing 2, had transmitted the first official word of the attack: "Air Raid Pearl Harbor X, this is not drill." During the second wave, Ramsey coordinated rescue operations while continuing to gather intelligence on Japanese tactics and aircraft types. His detailed observations would prove invaluable for future Pacific operations. The second wave attack lasted approximately 30 minutes, ending around 0945 hours. As the last Japanese aircraft departed, an eerie silence fell over Pearl Harbor, broken only by the crackle of flames, the hiss of steam from ruptured pipes, and the cries of wounded men calling for help. The harbor, which had awakened to peaceful Sunday morning sunlight, now resembled a vision of maritime hell. Admiral Nagumo, aboard the carrier Akagi, faced a crucial decision. Should he launch a third wave to complete the destruction of Pearl Harbor's repair facilities and fuel storage, or withdraw his task force before American forces could mount an effective counterattack? As smoke billowed across Pearl Harbor, and the second wave of Japanese aircraft disappeared into the morning sky, individual acts of heroism emerged from the chaos. Like beacons of light in the darkness, the attack had lasted less than 2 hours. But in that brief span, ordinary American servicemen had revealed extraordinary courage under the most harrowing circumstances imaginable. Dolores Miller, a mess attendant third class aboard the USS West Virginia, embodied the spirit of heroism that would define America's response to Pearl Harbor. When the first torpedo struck his ship, Miller was below decks collecting laundry. Racing topside, he found his battle station destroyed and Captain Benyon mortally wounded. Without hesitation, Miller helped carry the dying captain to a safer location before manning a .50 caliber Browning machine gun, a weapon he had never been trained to operate. "I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine," Miller later recalled with characteristic understatement. For approximately 15 minutes, the young sailor from Texas fired at attacking Japanese aircraft, claiming at least 2 confirmed hits. His actions were particularly remarkable, given that Navy regulations at the time prohibited African American sailors from receiving gunnery training. Miller's courage would eventually earn him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first African Americans to receive such recognition. As documented in official Navy casualty reports from 1942, the USS Arizona's destruction created one of the most challenging rescue scenarios of the entire attack. Seaman First Class Joe George found himself trapped below decks as the battleship burned around him. Water from firefighting efforts was rising rapidly in the compartment, while superheated metal threatened to seal his escape routes permanently. George discovered 5 other sailors in similar predicament, including Seaman Donald Stratton, who was severely burned but conscious. Working together in near total darkness, the group found a small porthole that might provide escape. George, the smallest man present, squeezed through first, then helped pull his shipmates to safety. His quick thinking and refusal to abandon his comrades saved 6 lives that would otherwise have been lost. Chief Aviation Ordnanceman John Finn was at Kaneohe Naval Air Station when Japanese fighters began strafing the facility. Despite being wounded multiple times by machine gun fire, Finn remained at his post manning a .50 caliber machine gun for over 2 hours. His sustained defensive fire helped protect other personnel and prevented additional aircraft from being destroyed on the ground. "I was mad as hell," Finn later explained. "Those Japanese had no right coming here and shooting up our base." His wounds were so severe that medical personnel initially believed he was dying, but Finn's determination kept him fighting throughout the attack for his extraordinary valor. He would receive the Medal of Honor. The rescue efforts at Battleship Row demonstrated American ingenuity and compassion under extreme duress. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua aboard the USS Arizona organized firefighting teams and evacuation efforts despite the ship being engulfed in flames and continuing to explode from secondary detonations. Fuqua's calm leadership saved numerous lives and earned him the Medal of Honor. Seaman First Class James Ward, who had first spotted the incoming Japanese aircraft aboard the USS Oklahoma, found himself trapped underwater as his ship capsized. Ward and 31 other sailors survived in an air pocket within the overturned hull for over 24 hours before rescue crews could cut through the steel plates to reach them. Their survival became a symbol of hope amid the tragedy. Contemporary medical reports, preserved in Naval Hospital Pearl Harbor archives, revealed the extraordinary efforts of medical personnel during and after the attack. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class William Schauf worked continuously for 36 hours treating wounded sailors, many suffering severe burns from burning fuel oil, despite being wounded himself by bomb fragments. Schauf refused medical attention until all other casualties had been treated. The civilian population of Oahu also displayed remarkable courage. Mrs. Annie Fox, chief nurse at Hickam Hospital, organized medical care for wounded military personnel while Japanese aircraft strafed the facility. Her calm professionalism under fire earned her the Purple Heart, making her the first woman to receive this decoration. At Wheeler Field, Staff Sergeant Joseph Pesek ignored repeated strafing attacks to rescue wounded airmen from burning aircraft. Pesek made multiple trips into the inferno, carrying unconscious pilots to safety while ammunition exploded around him. His actions saved at least 12 lives, though he suffered severe burns that required months of hospitalization. These individual stories of heroism, multiplied hundreds of times across Pearl Harbor, revealed the character that would carry America through for years of global warfare. As Admiral Chester Nimitz would later observe, uncommon valor was a common virtue on December 7th, 1941. The heroes of Pearl Harbor came from every background, every region of America, every level of military hierarchy. They proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared beyond the horizon, at approximately 09:45 hours, Pearl Harbor resembled a maritime graveyard. The once mighty Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, its battleships either sunk, capsized, or severely damaged. Thick black smoke rose from burning vessels and fuel oil, creating an apocalyptic scene that would be seared into the memories of all who witnessed it. The human cost was staggering. 2,403 Americans had been killed, with an additional 1,178 wounded. The USS Arizona alone accounted for 1,177 deaths, nearly half the total casualties. Among the dead were Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg, both killed aboard Arizona when her magazines exploded. The Oklahoma had capsized, trapping over 400 sailors inside her steel tomb. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood amid the wreckage of his command, surveying the destruction with growing realization of its implications. The Pacific Fleet's battle line had been effectively eliminated in less than 2 hours. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed. Arizona and Oklahoma were total losses, while West Virginia and California had sunk at their moorings. Nevada was beached and damaged, and Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee had suffered varying degrees of harm, as documented in official Navy damage assessments compiled in late 1941. The material losses extended far beyond the battleships. 3 cruisers had been damaged, along with 3 destroyers and several auxiliary vessels. At the airfields, 188 aircraft had been destroyed and 159 damaged. The Japanese had achieved their primary objective of neutralizing American naval power in the Pacific, at least temporarily. Yet Admiral Yamamoto's concerns about awakening a sleeping giant would prove prophetic. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, informed of the attack while having lunch at the White House, immediately grasped its historical significance. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox rushed to the White House, where Roosevelt was already drafting his response to what he would famously term a date which will live in infamy. The attack had achieved complete tactical surprise, but strategically, it represented a catastrophic miscalculation by Japanese leadership. Americans, previously divided about entering World War II, were now united in their determination to seek revenge. The isolationist movement, which had been a significant political force, collapsed overnight. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, a prominent isolationist, captured the national mood. That day ended isolationism for any realist. Contemporary intelligence analyses preserved in War Department files revealed that the Japanese had made several crucial errors despite their tactical success. The submarine pens had been largely undamaged, leaving America's underwater fleet intact. More importantly, the massive oil storage tanks had survived, containing over 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil essential for Pacific operations. The destruction of these facilities would have forced the Pacific Fleet to retreat to the West Coast, potentially for years. Most significantly, none of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers had been present during the attack. USS Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island, while USS Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway Island. USS Saratoga was in San Diego undergoing repairs. These three vessels would form the nucleus of America's eventual counteroffensive, proving that battleships, despite their symbolic importance, were no longer the decisive weapons of naval warfare. The immediate aftermath saw a massive rescue and recovery operation. Captain William Calhoun, Pearl Harbor's port director, organized efforts to refloat damaged vessels and clear the harbor of debris. The USS Nevada, which had been beached near the harbor entrance, became a priority for salvage operations to prevent blocking the channel. Rear Admiral William Furlong, commanding the Naval Base Defense Forces, implemented emergency security measures while coordinating with Army commanders to prepare for potential invasion. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese submarines might still be operating in Hawaiian waters, and radar operators reported unidentified aircraft contacts throughout the afternoon. The psychological impact on American forces was complex. While the surprise attack had been devastating, the courage displayed by individual servicemen during the crisis provided hope for the future. Stories of heroism spread rapidly through military units, reinforcing determination to exact vengeance upon Japan. Medical facilities throughout Oahu worked frantically to treat the wounded. Tripler Army Hospital and Naval Hospital Pearl Harbor were overwhelmed with casualties, many suffering severe burns from burning fuel oil. Civilian hospitals in Honolulu also opened their doors to military casualties, demonstrating the unity that would characterize America's war effort. As darkness fell on December 7, 1941, America found itself transformed from a nation at peace to a nation at war, united by tragedy but strengthened by resolve. The news of Pearl Harbor spread across the American mainland like wildfire, transmitted through radio broadcasts that interrupted regular Sunday programming with bulletins that would change the nation forever. At 2:26 Eastern Standard Time, CBS correspondent John Daly broke into the network's broadcast of the New York Philharmonic concert with the terse announcement, "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air. President Roosevelt has just announced." In living rooms, restaurants, and gathering places across America, citizens absorbed the shocking news with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and grim determination. The attack had occurred during afternoon hours on the East Coast, catching millions of Americans in the midst of their Sunday routines. Families gathered around their Philco and RCA radio sets, hanging on every word as sketchy details emerged from the distant Pacific. President Roosevelt, meeting with his closest advisors in the White House, immediately understood that December 7, 1941, marked a fundamental turning point in American history. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's most trusted confidant, found the president deadly calm as he absorbed reports from Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, and General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. The initial reports were fragmentary and often contradictory, but the scale of the disaster quickly became apparent. Secretary of War Henry Stimson rushed to the White House, where he found Roosevelt in the Oval Office surrounded by maps of the Pacific. "They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor," Roosevelt informed him. "We are all in the same boat now." The president's famous composure masked the profound implications. He recognized immediately America could no longer avoid full participation in World War II. Contemporary newspaper accounts, particularly those preserved in the archives of the Washington Post and the New York Times, captured the national mood in the hours following the attack. Editorial writers struggled to find words adequate to express the magnitude of the event. "The die is cast," proclaimed the New York Times in its evening edition. "America faces her greatest challenge since the Civil War." Congressional leaders, summoned to emergency meetings, found themselves confronting a reality that few had anticipated despite growing tensions with Japan. Senator Tom Connally of Texas, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, reportedly pounded his desk and shouted, "How did it happen that our warships were caught like tame ducks in Pearl Harbor?" The question would echo through congressional investigations for years to come. The attack's impact extended far beyond government circles. In Detroit, automobile workers at Ford's River Rouge plant spontaneously organized rallies, supporting immediate retaliation against Japan. In New York's Times Square, crowds gathered despite the winter cold, many carrying hastily made signs demanding war. The isolationist movement, which had commanded significant popular support just hours earlier, found itself suddenly marginalized and politically irrelevant. Japanese Americans faced immediate suspicion and hostility from their neighbors, foreshadowing the tragic internment that would follow. In California, where the largest population of Japanese Americans resided, reports of vandalism and threats began emerging within hours of the attack. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting on pre-prepared lists, began rounding up prominent Japanese American community leaders for questioning. Military installations across the continental United States went on maximum alert, with commanders uncertain whether Pearl Harbor represented the opening of a broader assault on American territory. The Panama Canal Zone, America's other major Pacific installation, received emergency reinforcement orders. Anti-aircraft batteries at major ports from San Diego to Seattle prepared for attacks that never materialized. Industrial leaders recognized immediately that America's factories would need to convert from peacetime to wartime production with unprecedented speed. William Knudsen, head of the Office of Production Management, began emergency consultations with automobile executives about shifting from civilian to military vehicle production. The seeds of what would become America's arsenal of democracy were planted in those first shocked hours after Pearl Harbor. Religious leaders across the nation offered prayers and counsel to congregations struggling to comprehend the attack's meaning. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick at New York's Riverside Church delivered an impromptu evening service, telling his parishioners, "We face the darkness, but we do not face it alone." Similar scenes played out in churches, synagogues, and mosques throughout America as spiritual leaders helped their communities process the tragedy. By evening, President Roosevelt had completed work on his address to Congress. Scheduled for the following day, Grace Tully, his personal secretary, typed the final draft of what would become known as the infamous speech, one of the most powerful addresses in American political history. Roosevelt's words would crystallize the national mood and formally request a declaration of war against Japan. As Americans went to sleep on December 7, 1941, they knew their world had changed irrevocably. The age of American neutrality was ending, replaced by total commitment to victory in a global war. December 8, 1941, dawned gray and somber in Washington, District of Columbia, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt prepared to address a joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Japan. The Capitol building, draped in the symbols of American democracy, would witness one of the most consequential speeches in the nation's history, delivered just 25 hours after the attack that had shocked the world. At 12:30 Eastern Standard Time, President Roosevelt entered the House chamber, his steel leg braces concealed beneath his formal attire, his face grave but determined. The assembled senators and representatives, along with Supreme Court justices and members of the diplomatic corps, rose in respectful silence as the president approached the podium. Radio microphones carried his words to millions of Americans and to the world beyond. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt began his distinctive voice resonating with controlled anger and moral certainty. The president's opening words captured both the shock of the attack and his determination to rally the nation for the struggle ahead. Roosevelt's speech, lasting just over 6 minutes, was a masterpiece of political rhetoric that transformed American public opinion overnight. He detailed the perfidy of the Japanese attack, noting that even as their diplomats negotiated in Washington, their military forces were launching their surprise assault. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago, he declared. The president's request for a declaration of war was both inevitable and overwhelming in its support. When the House voted at 1:33 that afternoon, the tally was 388 to 1, with only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana voting against the war resolution. The Senate vote was unanimous, 82 to 0. America was now officially at war with Japan, ending decades of neutrality and isolation. Contemporary congressional records, preserved in the National Archives, documented the extraordinary unity that characterized the legislative response. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana, previously one of the most prominent isolationists, declared, "The only thing we can do now is to lick hell out of them." This sentiment echoed throughout the Capitol and across the nation. As Americans put aside their political differences to confront the Japanese threat, the declaration of war against Japan was only the beginning. On December 11th, Adolf Hitler honored Germany's commitment to the Tripartite Pact by declaring war on the United States. Followed immediately by Mussolini's Italy, Roosevelt requested and received congressional approval for declarations of war against both European Axis powers, formally bringing America into the global conflict on multiple fronts. The transformation of American society accelerated dramatically in the weeks following Pearl Harbor. Military recruitment offices were overwhelmed with volunteers seeking to enlist. Johnny Jones, a 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa, typified the national response when he told his local recruiting sergeant, "Those Japanese killed Americans at Pearl Harbor. I want to go over there and kill some of them back." Within months, over 16 million Americans would serve in the armed forces. Industrial mobilization began immediately, with automobile plants converting to aircraft and tank production. The Ford Willow Run plant would eventually produce one B-24 Liberator bomber. Every hour, symbolizing America's manufacturing miracle, Rosie the Riveter became the iconic representation of millions of women who entered the workforce to replace men serving overseas. The attack's strategic consequences extended far beyond America's entry into the war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, appointed to command the Pacific Fleet on December 31st, 1941, would build upon the foundation of heroism demonstrated at Pearl Harbor to eventually achieve total victory over Japan. The carriers that escaped destruction on December 7th would form the nucleus of the fleet that won decisive battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and throughout the Pacific Island campaigns. Pearl Harbor survivors carried the memory of that terrible morning throughout the war and beyond. Seaman First Class Donald Stratton, severely burned aboard the Arizona, recovered from his injuries and returned to combat aboard the destroyer USS Stack. Participating in numerous Pacific battles, his service exemplified the resilience and determination that Pearl Harbor survivors brought to America's war effort. The attack that was intended to cripple American resolve instead forged it into an unbreakable weapon. As Admiral Yamamoto had feared, Pearl Harbor awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with terrible resolve. The road to victory would be long, costly, and uncertain, but the courage displayed in Pearl Harbor's burning waters on December 7th, 1941, provided the moral foundation for America's ultimate triumph. The men who died at Pearl Harbor were not forgotten. Their sacrifice became the rallying cry for a generation of Americans who would fight across the Pacific from Guadalcanal to Okinawa until Japan's eventual surrender in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. Remember, Pearl Harbor became more than a slogan. It became a sacred trust between the living and the dead, a promise that their sacrifice would not be in vain. This account draws upon official U.S. Navy historical records, congressional testimony, and first-hand accounts of Pearl Harbor survivors, compiled from sources including the Naval History and Heritage Command Archives and the Pearl Harbor History Associates Oral History Project.